Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second in our series of 3 conversations about open data. I'm Palace Hupay-Cotter, and I am broadcasting to you live from Wellington, New Zealand's capital city, and I am broadcasting you on behalf of Land Information New Zealand. Today, we are very happy to welcome a very special guest, and we're going to throw her picture up there while I list all of her titles, because again, another top expert in our field is joining us, and her name is Beth Simone Novak. She is a law professor who has been described as a tech pioneer in the policy world. She is co-founder and director of the GovLab at New York University and its MacArthur Research Network on Opening Governance. Her mission is to improve people's lives by changing how we govern by using technology to improve transparency, participation, and problem solving, and open data is, of course, a big part of that. Now, Beth is joining us from New York City. We are, again, in Wellington at the BizDojo Wellington Collider, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, Beth. But some of your exciting roles have been as the United States Deputy Chief Technology Officer and the director of President Obama's Open Government Initiative. That was from 2009 to 2011. So you've been at the center of all of this open data and open government.
Indeed. Well, I'm very delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time. It is Open Data Day, not just here in New Zealand, but around the world, so we're pretty excited about that. No better way to celebrate than talking to you. So I am going to start by asking you, as I did Joel, your colleague, in our previous conversation, how you would describe open data to the uninitiated.
So open data, and I can see why you've asked Joel and you're asking me, it's not always an easy concept to understand, right? So government is in the position of collecting a great deal of information about the companies that it regulates, about the built and natural environment, and about individuals, whether it through the delivery of health care or criminal justice or other services that it provides to us. So open data, first and foremost, is about the technologies, the policies, and the platforms that allow us to make that data, that government, but we can talk about other institutions as well, available back to the people from whom it collects it, available in downloadable, raw formats, and usually free of charge. What that means is, when I say downloadable and raw, I think the important thing is that there's lots of ways in which data is often accessible. In other words, we can look up a single piece of information, the price of a house, or the profits that have been made by a company. But when you make all of a data set available, it allows other people to analyze that data, visualize that data, run comparisons, see trends, develop new apps and solutions. So it's really, in short, about the process of opening up a whole data set so that people other than the people who've collected that data can actually make use of it in new ways.
I had a slide up while you were describing some of that, also talking about open data being the democratic imperative, which sort of gets into your area of passion in particular. So what does that mean to those out there?
So I think what makes open data significant is not simply that it's about shining a light back on, let's say, the money that government spends, or the rates of infection in a hospital, or the location of farmers markets in a community, or, as was so important in New Zealand, the location of buildings after the earthquake in a few years ago. What makes all of this significant is not simply that the data is available, it's that the data becomes the raw material to engage other people. It's a tool for participation. So the data by itself is really quite meaningless. It's when third parties, citizens, entrepreneurs, students, professors, people in the private sector, in the public sector, again, make use of that data to have conversations, and above all, to solve the problems that data presents, to draw insights from that data, that is actually what makes it exciting from a democratic perspective. So it's not just about the transparency, it's about the participation that it engenders.
And I'm so looking forward to actually digging into some of that you were describing there, because there is such a deep well of case studies, examples all around the world that you have worked with, studied, and talked about. But this does get into the open government discussion, and that, again, is your particular area of expertise. So how would you describe open government, and how does it change the lives of its citizens?
So open government is I was telling my students yesterday that when we chose to adopt the term in the Obama administration back in 2009, we chose to use the term open government. The original term we were using was actually open and innovative government. Because the idea that we had in mind was that it wasn't simply open in the sense of transparent. That surely is the piece of it. It's about, again, making visible and scrutinizable, if you will, the workings of government, how government spends money, how it makes decisions, what its processes are. But we were drawing not simply on the idea of transparency, but the concept of open innovation. In other words, that the goal is about changing the relationship between government and citizens, the way the businesses have come in many cases to change the relationship between those firms and their customers. What do I mean by that? Well, the point is that open government is one in which citizens and government work together to solve problems. Raw data and open data becomes essentially the raw material that enables that, right? But ultimately the goal is the working together, the collaboration, what's now often called co-creation, or what in the business world they call open innovation, the working together across those boundaries to actually tackle challenges. So for me, open government is very much not limited to merely to shining a light on the workings of government. It's really about solving the problems that we're facing, whether it's a pandemic like Zika, or the challenge and threat of global warming, whether it's rising incarceration rates, a great challenge for us in the United States in particular, or the rising costs and effectiveness of healthcare, something we face the world over. All of these challenges, I believe, can be better addressed when more people with more diverse ideas come together to solve problems informed by data. And so open data, again, becomes the mechanism by which we do that, but that only becomes possible when we have institutions that are open and collaborative in the way that they work, that are open government. That may have been a long answer to a short question. I think the main thing to take away is it's not only transparency, it's about solving problems.
Well, yes, and I'm afraid that all of the questions surrounding these two areas that have an area of intersect and an area where they're different are going to be long answers because it's not a straightforward concept, although parts of it can be. And there was a slide that we just showed saying that open data, it basically is using technology as one of the tools in the toolkit to bring about social change. So I'm hoping that you agree that that's a one way to sort of boil it down a bit.
Well, I think I said that, so I'm sure that I agree.
Well,
I agree with it. But it's definitely a tool in the toolkit of social change. And if you like, I'll give you an example. I'd rather give you short answers and longer examples. And it's a favorite example that I always give. Actually, I have many of them that I could cite to, and I think that others, hopefully on Twitter, will point to. So you take an example like what's happened in Mexico, where they have opened up data about the performance and also financial and fiscal issues around how schools are run in Mexico. And what does that allow? That allows for people to be able to scrutinize the payroll and to discover that there are about 1,500 teachers who are on the payroll, all of whom have the exact same identical birth date. And that birth date puts them all at, I believe, 102 years old, and they're all in the same city. So obviously what you can spot is that there is some fraud going on and there's a problem, and it's, again, not about the transparency by itself, it's about that feedback loop, what happens next, to the fact that then we can do something about eliminating that fraud, waste, and abuse. It's about when in Tanzania they do also put school data up online, enabling citizens and the government to see dramatic performance differences between schools. And this, we're seeing similar phenomena in other countries where it allows parents to be able to say, why is my kid going to a school where the testing rate, the performance rate, if you will, the passing rate is one thing, and the school down the street is doing so much better? What's the difference? What's happening? And what can we do about it? So lots of examples like that where we're seeing the ability to allow citizens to make more informed and better choices and to push government to deliver better services, where you're also seeing ways in which government is itself able to deliver better services. So in Chicago, when they open up the data about foodborne illness, they can see not only which restaurants are most likely to lead to, a very bad stomachache the next day, but they can create an algorithm that allows them to change how they inspect restaurants. So instead of doing what every city does, which is to go down the list, A through Z, and examine every restaurant, they can say, gee, maybe we should prioritize that dodgy food truck outside my door that looks like a mobile foodborne illness waiting to happen, and can inspect that first. So when, especially in hard economic times when government has scarce resources and not enough regulators or inspectors to go around. We have the ability to deliver a service better, in other words, to target enforcement more effectively. So it's hopefully allowing us to do better decision making by government, but also better decision making by citizens as part of that process. So just a couple of examples.
So the other side of that, of course, are the people who are concerned about privacy issues, I should say. So the question that comes from them is, can open data actually hurt government? And not necessarily open government, but just government as a whole and the role it's supposed to play in our society with the greater good being the highest priority.
So you're getting into the question of what I like to think about as shades of open, right? So there's clearly that data which government collects, the location of farmers markets in our communities, the location of population estimates, population level anonymous data, which is utterly uncontroversial to release and should be made available back to citizens because, number one, as taxpayers, we paid for its collection, and number two, as citizens in a democracy, we believe and feel that it's important that this data be open to us and we're entitled to it. But then there's that data which may be contain, names of individuals, whether it's healthcare data, whether it's criminal records, whether it's data, that identifies or could potentially lead to the identification of an individual, where we have to obviously take more care about how we make that data available and under what circumstances, where what we need is responsible practices for sharing data. And I think a lot of, many different systems, criminal justice, health, education, around the world, people are struggling with the question of how to do that and how to do that well. So I had the wonderful pleasure of speaking this morning to the head of, essentially the head of mental health for the National Health Service in the UK this morning. And she told me about a fabulous project called Fingerprints. Fingerprints? I think I've got that right. It's either fingerprints or footprints. I think it's fingertips. That's what it is, fingertips. In other words, at your fingertips, mental health professionals should have all the data that they need to understand and be able to predict rates of occurrence of common mental illnesses community by community. The idea being, and according to her, that so many of the problems that lead to expensive hospitalization, expensive and catastrophic hospitalization and worse, is preventable when you can treat the underlying mental health causes that lead, for example, to the alcoholism, which leads to the domestic abuse, which leads to the far worse crime and violence and pain and hurt for families and communities. But we can only figure out how to develop those interventions and target those resources when we have the data that tells us where and how the prevalence of mental illness is going to occur. So this Fingertips project, is doing a wonderful job at making use of anonymized population-level data, but community by community, to develop tools that work for mental health professionals, doctors, and other social service providers. But what gets exciting and interesting is what about when we actually have data now that could allow us to target interventions individual by individual to address mental health concerns, for example, to prevent an arrest or an incarceration before it happens, to get people the treatment and help that they need. We obviously get into some very difficult and tricky questions that are no longer, let me say, the black and white we've faced before of privacy versus open. It's not about privacy and civil liberties as an alternative to open. We may be living in an age in which we can actually serve civil liberties better. We can deliver better services and help the most vulnerable among us by using data in new ways. But we have to do so with care and with a great deal of responsibility. So that gets us into shades of open. It's not open data in the sense of fully anonymous, downloadable data sets. But there is what's coming next, I think, is much more granular uses of data on a pseudonymous or identifiable basis, about which we have to have a lot of long, hard conversations about how to do it and how to do it well. But I think open data by itself, uncontroversial and unproblematical.
Interesting, though, particularly in a country the size of New Zealand, and this came up in the conversation with Joel, because when you do get down to the granular level of the data, sometimes by process of elimination, you can identify people, and that's just using raw data. But then, yes, this idea of being able to be proactive with mental health issues certainly does benefit the society in general, keeping down costs of incarceration, if nothing else, if people want to look at it in dollars and cents. This does, though, speak to the idea of information management principles. And so all the data out there and how we handle it, as well as how we make it readable and accessible, it seems that we all should be, ideally, working off the same song sheet, so to speak. And so I know that in New Zealand, they've been very good at the governmental ministry level of trying to come up with some of those principles, and those are similar to some that are being discussed on a global stage. But how close are we, in a global sense, to getting a set of the same principles under which we all work when we use open data?
So I think there has been great progress toward the creation, at least, of a baseline open data charter, which was released this past year. Joel and I both have the privilege of serving on the steering committee for that open data charter that allows us at least to ascribe to some general principles around the openness of these kinds of public, non-personally identifiable data sets, and especially data sets that involve the working of government and how government spends money and the functioning of government, but in addition, data that the government collects about the economy and about society, recognizing it as a potential tool for social good. I think it's just a first step, though. Obviously, there are these I think we do not yet have a clear view, and there's a great deal of controversy around the governance and handling of more sensitive data. There's obviously no agreement about the certain kinds of both corporate and national security data and where to draw the line as far as what should and shouldn't be made available online. And many people have been fighting for a long time for the disclosure and access to a lot of, let's call it, data out of the national security realm, nuclear secrets and other kinds of sort of, let's call it, traditional national security types of questions where there is no settled agreement as to what should be provided. Regulatory data that is anyway public, that's collected from companies, we can generally agree should be made public as open data, but I think a lot of companies would not agree that their tax returns should be put up online, or that all information should be made available. And I think so there is no, I think, global standard around certain kinds of information. And then again, when it comes to these areas of personally sensitive information, healthcare, education, criminal justice, we can all agree that population-level anonymous data is fine and quite beneficial to put up online. We can also agree that the data about ourselves we should get back, though we don't always have the right technology and the best means to do that, to give people back their own healthcare records or their own criminal justice records. But I think the gray part in between of how to make better use of that data, potentially by giving it to accredited researchers or allowing for some data sharing across different parts of government, imagine mental health and prisons, for example, or mental health and criminal justice. I don't think we have settled principles yet about how to do these things in the modern age.
Well, I am going to just mention at this particular moment that we are live streaming, again, from the BizDojo Collider Wellington, and we have a hashtag out there for those of you who are interested in sending in your questions via Twitter. It is hashtag Open Data Leadership. I'm also going to mention, Beth, that you, again, had this huge role in the U.S. government under President Obama, and you described this idea of creating open government using data and technology as, and this is directly your quote, re-engineering a plane while it's flying, which I thought was fabulous. I think there's so many quotes of yours out there in this discussion, it's impossible to identify them all, but this one for sure. It turns out
that one really stole from someone else, but I
of course.
And I said it. I don't think I coined it, but
okay.
It definitely feels like that when you're working in government.
Yes, and you're talking about something that needs to have creative ways to describe it. So, well, we tried. So my point is, what were the most significant challenges when you had that role, and how did you find that you could overcome some of them? I know you couldn't overcome all of them.
Well, if I could have overcome all of them, well, the world would be a better place. I don't even know if we took a chink out of the iceberg, but we at least found the iceberg in the dark, essentially. So challenges, look, those challenges continue. first and foremost, the challenge in the U.S. context is very much a cultural one. And I say in the U.S. context because we at least had the leg up of having a legal framework that allowed us to easily open up data legally. In other words, in the United States, unlike in many former British colonies, we do not have a concept of crown copyright. We have, the law says that information that is created by the U.S. government is actually not subject to copyright. It's automatically in the public domain. So that allowed us to overcome at least one hurdle quite easily that for other countries has been more difficult, who've had to figure out how do we essentially overcome the concept of ownership by government of information. But even though we had this legal advantage of not having copyright as a concern, the cultural hurdles to making data open and available were and remain still very much prevalent. The fears about if we open up data, will people criticize us, right? Because if you open up data which shows that you have 1,500 people on your payroll who are shouldn't be there, somebody's going to get a drubbing in the press, right? So there's a concern that it is politically challenging to open oneself up to scrutiny. There is obviously these concerns about privacy and anonymity, right? So, and Joel's point that even with so-called open data sets or anonymous data sets, you can sometimes, there's the danger that someone can triangulate the use of the data. There is the concern above all that of saying we're putting out, we are putting out data because we don't have the answer to the problem, and we don't know and we need help with something that is also culturally, I think, very difficult. But above all, I think the most difficult thing is the fact that we lack experience either on the institutional side or the civic side with engendering that collaboration between government and citizens. For so long, the relationship has either been that of watching the watchers, right? We elect people to lead us, and then we sit back and we watch. Or it's to be the critics, right? Whether it's through the media or in other capacities to criticize government and hold it to account. And both those roles we're very familiar with. The one which is we're supposed to ask government to give us a data set and then sit down and have a hackathon where we create an app sitting shoulder to shoulder with government officials to solve a problem is a very new and different process that frankly no one is all that accustomed to. So we're beginning to see examples of it, but I think it's quite challenging. So developing the cultural practice of co-creating solutions to problems with citizens is not one that we're well accustomed to doing. I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Now
we had a slide up while you were talking, and it was a phrase that Joel used in our conversation last week called data hugging disorder, which I particularly liked. The slide said a strong tendency by agencies to guard the data collected, citing various concerns, as you mentioned, about control, quality, and the expertise required to understand and correctly interpret the data. So that seems to be an issue, cultural issue, that needs to be overcome. And this is not just in the U.S. Governmental system, but it's around the world, I'm assuming. And I think you did actually mention that there are pockets of promise in parts of the world where they're overcoming this, or they're making this cultural shift. One was in Sao Paulo, the Open Government University.
Yeah, so I think there are, let me make one friendly amendment to the data hugging disorder phenomenon, and then I'll be happy to talk about the Sao Paulo. Let me do that first, which is in Sao Paulo, the government, the largest city in Brazil, has recognized with an admirable degree of humility that the government and people who work in government are not necessarily as tech savvy, as innovative as maybe some of the people whom they serve. So what they did was they turned the concept of civil service training on its head, and they started an open government university in which they said, why don't you, the citizens, teach us, the civil servants, about data, about technology, about innovation, and how to practice it. And so beginning about last November, they started a first series of courses. I think since then they've put about 24,000 civil servants through training courses taught by citizens, not by professional civil servants, trying to remedy essentially that innovation gap between public servants and the people in the private sector whom they serve. So I think it's a wonderful way of overcoming the one other problem that I would add to this data hugging disorder, which is besides the kind of tendency to, you know, say it's mine, it's ours, and nobody could possibly be smart enough to know what to do with this, or I can't possibly put this out there. The challenge is even when people are well-intentioned and want to share data, there's often a tremendous lack of capacity about how to use it and what to do with it. So it's not always coming from a kind of, you know, a critical perspective. It's really just that many people, including myself, who've been in public service are trained as lawyers. We're trained in public administration schools. We're trained in places that have typically not taught anything more quantitative than a basic statistics course, if that. And so you have organizations full of very good, let me call them good managers in a traditional sense. They are good policymakers in a 20th century sense, but they are not well equipped to make use of the data. So the example about mental health that I was giving you earlier today, the same doctor I was speaking to, her great challenge, I thought this sounded like the most wonderful story, that you have this unbelievable dashboard of data about mental health across the whole UK, and it combines mental health data with employment data, educational data. You can see wonderful, kind of really get a picture at a granular level, city by city, that can give you real insight into the prevalence and likely occurrence of mental health conditions. The challenge is, she says, that the decision makers are not in a position to gain insight from that data. So they have great tools, but how do you turn that into actual decisions and actions? Another conversation similarly, and I'm going to come back to the UK simply because I was there last week, wonderful things that they're doing in terms of both collecting and then also opening up data about the performance of hospitals. So you can know the difference about your likelihood of, you know, success if you have a heart surgery in Swansea versus in Manchester, or a hip replacement in Leeds versus Bristol. But if I'm a manager in a hospital or a doctor in a practice or even a patient, what do I do with this information? So that ability to go from raw information to insight is one that we are lacking. We don't have enough people, especially inside government, but also outside of it, who know how to look at the data and make sense of it. So we have lots of people crusading to open up data. We have people crusading, for example, to make all of the underlying clinical trial data available that underlies every drug that's approved for the marketplace. And absolutely, drug companies should have to tell us the research upon which their drugs are based. But we need people who can actually scrutinize that research. And that means we need funding for it, we need training for it, and we need the people who have the skills to actually do the digging and the looking.
Would you call that data literacy?
I guess I would call it data literacy or capacity or capability or whatever the term is. It is a...
It's 6 o'clock.
Oh, sorry, that's my computer talking.
Okay. Random, but that's okay.
In the United States, it does that every hour. The point is, I think it's not just about being numerate. It's about the social science skills to draw insight, to formulate a hypothesis and draw insight from data, which is something at the intersection between numeracy and a kind of social science literacy that all of us have the capacity to develop. So none of us have the ability should be able to make the excuse, I'm just a lawyer, I'm just a policy person, oh, I wasn't very good in maths in school, because it's not just about the math. The math can be done by our computers, but the hard job of understanding the problem and formulating a hypothesis and thinking about what data to use to address it is, I think, the skill that we can and all need to develop.
Well, that actually does give me an idea about where we're headed as a society, because, you know, one of the things that came out of our conversation before was that open data has a chance of impacting our lives as much as the World Wide Web. Well, how is that, and how far are we from that? There is an exponential growth in data sets that are now available, but who's using it, who has the critical thinking skills to use it to find those business opportunities or to be more participatory in government. So do you have a timeline? I mean, what is it going to take to get us over that and to that ideal day, which I will ask you about at the end because I did that to Joel, ideal day in a participatory government, open government using open data. But is there a timeline, and can we expect those of us who are experts in our own fields but not experts in knowing how to interpret and apply data?
So so as to the timeline or as to the world, so the fact that it's going to be as transformative as the World Wide Web, that is something that Joel surely said. That sounds like a Joel quote, which would be the quote if you've written the preeminent book on open data. I would expect nothing less than that. And I do recommend to people Joel's book, Open Data Now, which is a great primer on the topic. And it's a great primer on the topic for not simply for people in government, but for people in business or in, let's call it the real world, who have a lot of reason to care about this. I think what's going to happen, like as with so many, hopefully, innovations, in the same way, just to come back to the web analogy, and maybe Joel did this, remember we used to have this thing called e-commerce? Do you remember e-commerce? Yeah. E-commerce is what we called it when there was commerce and e-commerce. And now, it's all just commerce. It's all business. We don't use that term anymore because the novelty that is the web has receded into the background. Amazon is a bookseller. Maybe a few other things you want to call it, but they surely are a bookseller. We don't think of them as an e-bookseller or as somehow distinct from a Chapters or a Borders or a Barnes & Noble or pick your other chain or your local bookseller. And in the same way, before I get into trouble making statements about global conglomerates, in the same way, open data will hopefully just become the way that we do business. And that is not to say, and yes, we will also see a rise because students want it and they demand it, and the marketplace is paying more for people who have the word data or science and data this. You say data science and your salary goes up by 40%. So everybody wants to know something about data. But it will become, hopefully, a way of working and a way of deciding and a way of doing that when government collects data, they open data at the same time. It will not become an afterthought. We will not be talking about, putting up data 3 years after the fact, but we will just be constantly making data available, enabling us to make better decisions more in real time, driven by data than we're able to do right now. So one of the big missing pieces, we talk about opening data, but we still haven't fully completed that feedback loop to use the data to change how government does things. So when I told you about Chicago changing how they inspect restaurants, from what I know, they are the only city that does that. The only city. So I can imagine in 3 years, every city will soon do that. Right, and the idea that the UK has this fabulous mental health database, which is available to all doctors, you can imagine that a few years from now, the UK and other countries that have a public health system as opposed to a private one like ours will have an easier time of doing that. But that should be the norm, a few years from now, whereas we begin to accelerate learning one from the other about how to do this and the ways in which it helps us to solve problems, we will hopefully be able to do more of. So I'm not sure I fully answered the question about what the timeline is, because it's going to involve changing how we educate students from a young age, and especially in professional school. It's going to change how we have to change whom we hire into government. We also have to change not only how government opens data, but how other kinds of entities open data. We haven't talked at all about open science data or about open corporate data and the concept of corporate data philanthropy. So I think there are the evolution towards the recognition that open data, in many contexts, though not in all, really would help us to do things better and differently. And that's the last point I should make here, which is we don't have enough granular understanding of when the game is worth the candle, because it is not free to make data freely available to people at this point. We often have to retrofit old systems. We have to take data that's currently in a shoebox on pen, in pen and pencil, or in an Excel spreadsheet, or in a PDF, and we have to, do things to make it open. It's not about a decision maker simply pushing a button. I was involved in a process to try to open up all of the historical and current patent data held by the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And the big challenge for us, after we overcame the political will issues and the cultural issues, was that we didn't have a server to put it on that wouldn't, have crashed the entire agency. Had we made the data available for download, the entire office would have fallen apart. So we ended up doing a no-cost deal with Google to host the data for the USPTO until it had the infrastructure to be able to do it for itself. And so you can continue to now go to google.com/patents and not only look up a patent, but download the entire corpus of the Patent Office database to make your own tools. So there are often very seemingly silly but hard hurdles to overcome. So anyway, let me pause with that to say it's not tomorrow, but it's 5 years from now that this recedes into the background as the way of doing business, even if in every system we don't yet have the feedback loops that cause us to use the data we have very effectively.
Well, and that at least it gives us some roadmap, which is what I was looking for. And I do want to get back to your point about science or researchers and private companies. But I think we have a theme running through today's interview, and I cannot attribute that one quote to Joel Gould. He got it from someone else, so I have to laugh about that. But he also very generously mentioned his book, and I want to mention your book, Smart Citizens, Smarter State, is the most recent book that you have written about this. And your thinking has sort of evolved over the years as you've dealt with this topic. But going back to the open science and open corporate, I know that there's one example here on a local university campus where a researcher did a lot of work and then ended up deleting the data that he had collected because there was no place to serve it or to store it. And this is the sort of frustration that people who are aware of the potential and are sort of sitting in that intersect, that's what they're running up against. So this cultural shift of thinking is going to have to get down not just to government departments, but within the IT departments of universities. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely. Look, I sit at a large private university in the United States where we surely have, physicists and, epidemiologists who have servers on which they're used to putting the large data sets that they work with because they've always worked with data. But now you have poets, you have artists, you have English professors who also are beginning to work with and use data in new ways. I sit upstairs from the most fabulous data artist named Luc Dubois, recently spoke at TED, and if you haven't checked out his work, I recommend it to you. Luc makes art using large-scale data sets. Luc luckily knows how to put things on a server or find space in the Amazon cloud, perhaps, but many other people don't know what to do with their data, and above all, don't know how to make their data available to others, because it's not just about storing that data somewhere. If you've done the work as a researcher, particularly funded by government grants, to collect data, let's say, about any one of a number of issues, environment or the poverty or crime or health, you ought to be making that data available to others to work with as well. And so in my university, as in many others, the library is asking itself in the 21st century, what do we need to do to provide those kinds of resources to faculty members, to staff members, to researchers, et cetera, and to students to be able to store and make data available. So again, colleagues of mine have a grant to look at how do we provide the infrastructure to host some of this data and make it available to other people. So that, I think, is another question that we will have to face. But we don't have the place to put it, and we also don't universally have the norms or have the practices. That data hugging disorder, I would say, is probably worse, ironically worse, among universities and than it is even within government these days, because there has been, people feel they've worked really hard to collect that data. That's my data set. That's my research. It's funded by my grants. There's also a lot of financial pressure that universities place on academics now to commercialize their work. Mm-hmm. There is not a uniform view, even among the vaunted sort of ivy-covered walls and halls, that the data that researchers collect should be open. And that's surely also not the case in hospitals or among medical and biomedical researchers yet, which I think is slowing down the pace of medical research, is the fact that we're not sharing the clinical data that we collect about patients, meaning that if a hospital collects, if I give a blood sample to my doctor and only my doctor does a research project using my blood sample and then it gets tossed, what a tremendous waste, because he is potentially only looking for one thing, whereas that same blood sample could be the data from that blood sample could be made available to 10 other people looking at 10 other things, potentially accelerating medical research. And that, by the way, is the significant advance that the Apple and Android health research stores, so ResearchKit for Apple and ResearchGate for Android, they're essentially app stores for clinical trials. That's why I would strongly encourage people to go there and sign up if you're interested in cardiovascular research and disease or dementia research and disease. The idea that you can go there if you contribute data through an app to one of those clinical trials, as a condition of being in that app store and getting access to you, the researchers at the other end have to make that data on an anonymized basis available openly to other researchers.
I have another slide. I said that's huge, actually, and that is all about the greater good. And I have another slide that's coming up that will tell some of the people who are viewing this right now where they can access open data. That is www.data.gov with the T at the end, .nz, and in the US it's www.data.gov, and in the UK it's www.data.gov.uk. The other phrase that you used, and there's so many fabulous phrases, as I said, in this data sphere, is corporate philanthropy or data philanthropy, and that's sort of talking about what big companies have in terms of their data sets and how willing and when they're willing to share them. And I understand that, and this may be an imperfect example, but during the Christchurch earthquakes, when the first responders were trying to get information about buildings and rescuing people, they did turn to private companies to get some of the data, and I think they were energy providers. So, you know, in certain instances, it seems like a clear imperative to provide the data sets, but maybe that's not necessarily as much an imperative in all situations.
No, I think it's a fabulous, it's a really wonderful example, and you can look at other examples like Twitter sharing its data back with others that allows for analysis of that data. It's drug companies, some of which have now committed to making their clinical trial data, the underlying data, the research on which their drugs are based, open and available to others. It's companies being willing to share data about cybersecurity risk and incident that allow us, when we share that data, to come to better solutions to problems. And so I think we're just at the beginning of this movement. To me, it's like the corporate social responsibility, or kind of recycling was, 2010, as recycling was 30 years ago, and corporate social responsibility has been in the last 10 or 20 years. Corporate data philanthropy may start to be a new way in which companies do well by doing good, which is namely sharing the data that they sit on. So, for example, there are a lot of large companies that collect data about, the environment and about climate and about, again, air and water quality conditions at a level that's equal to, if not greater than, an environmental agency does. And when you can combine data that's collected by a government with data that's collected by a corporation, and let's mention at the same time data that's gathered and collected by citizens, thousands of citizens potentially collecting and gathering data through their mobile phone, we then can sometimes get a much more granular picture of a situation in a way that we can't do when we only rely on government data. So, there are plenty of companies who collect data because they're interested in a particular marketplace, right? They're serving, if you care about children, for example, yes, there are government agencies and nonprofits that have data about children, but there also are companies that are selling toys and making games and clothes and other things for children who are doing a lot of research and have a lot of know-how, again, about those customers that they may have collected for reasons of doing well, but then if shared could actually be put to public use for purposes of doing good in the world. So I think we have to, and it's some work that we've been doing at GovLab, is trying to think about and work with private sector actors on looking at what are the models by which you can actually share such data and in a collaborative way for purposes of doing good in the world.
Well, thank you. That is a huge area that could be the topic of an entirely separate hour, I'm sure. But I do want to get on to something that you had mentioned recently in a Guardian article, and I think you brought this up in your book, Smart Citizen, Smarter State, about comparing this dating site Tinder to what government needs to do to engage the public. And it's such a fabulous example. I will let you describe what you mean by that.
I can't. So the somewhat facetiously, but only halfway, I like to make the joke that we need to do for democracy and for government what we've done for dating. In other words, in dating and in business, we're very good at using technology to create matches. In the dating context, it's obvious. We're matching people for purposes of a hookup, for relationships, for love, for marriage. In business, we're very good at using technology, and there are a lot of those high-priced data science graduates who go out to help companies match better their products with their customers, right? In other words, to target advertising to the right people at the right time to sell them a product. But we don't do a very good job of curating know-how and expertise among citizens to match them to opportunities to serve in government or for civic or for social purposes. And let me be clear that I'm not talking about picking people who get to participate to the exclusion of others. I'm simply talking about making opportunities to participate more visible to people who might know how to share, who may be passionate about a topic in ways that we have not done before. Because frankly, the way that we typically organize citizen engagement, well, either we don't do it at all because we govern behind closed doors, or now in the internet and web era, what we do is we go online and we say, hey, anybody out there who has a comment for how to improve X, Y, or Z, anyone out there who can solve a problem. And you know what happens? People don't show up. Or the people who show up are not the people you want to hear from. So we've advanced the ball by coming up with the idea that you can actually offer prizes to people. In the United States, we passed a law to make it legal for the federal government, and many states and localities have followed suit, to offer a challenge backed by a prize, to give an incentive to people to help solve a problem. But it still doesn't solve your targeted marketing issue, which is people don't necessarily know about the opportunity to participate. So it turns out, side note, a lot of these engagement efforts, as I understand, I was once told, I believe by the Secretary of State of a Midwestern state, that they put all their death records up online. I believe this is Minnesota, and they wanted to get them digitized, which because they opened it up and crowdsourced it, they were able to do in a short amount of time, because for some reason a large number of people from New Zealand were quite enamored of the idea of digitizing death records in a Midwestern state in the United States. Apparently people in New Zealand are very good at online participation. I've heard this more than once. A disproportionate number of people from down under like to do this. But even though in New Zealand you seem to be paying attention to these opportunities, maybe not everybody has heard about the fact that there is a challenge on challenge.gov to be solved, or there is a city in France that's looking for ideas about how to solve a problem, or the mayor of Houston issued a challenge for ways to save money. So the short idea is we can do a little bit better job using what I call the technologies of expertise, and I go into a lot more detail about what that means, but at the very minimum, just think about LinkedIn. We can do a lot better job of just finding out who's out there and alerting people to opportunities to serve. So when we're trying to debate a policy about education, we might actually ask teachers and let them know that we have a question that would benefit from their insight. And that insight...
Imagine that.
Yes. It seems pretty obvious, but it turns out we haven't done this before, and what I spend a lot of time in the book doing is giving hopefully a lot of examples about how we're starting to do this and how we could be doing more of it. And the book was published, the book was written obviously before it was published, and so in the ensuing time we've put together a set of stories online about things that have just happened in the last year, which you can find. I have a website called smarterstate.org, and you can find some of those stories about how public institutions are using new technology to actually target and reach out to people in new ways, whether it's civil servants and employees or whether it's citizens, that they're doing a better job of actually trying to do that kind of matchmaking, sort of in the way that Tinder does.
Well, it's a descriptive example, and this idea of incentivized public participation seems to be interesting. And I love the phrase, I don't know if it's my quote, but expert sourcing. I mean, that's essentially what you're doing rather than just crowdsourcing, shotgun approach, really delving into the areas of expertise in a targeted way.
I like the idea. Shotgun. It's exactly the right distinction, but let me just make very clear that when we say expert sourcing, expert doesn't mean credentialed elite. Expert, if you live in Christchurch, you have a certain expertise about earthquakes. It has nothing to do with how many degrees that you have. So it's finding that expertise, in other words, that wisdom, that know-how, that lived experience that can be very relevant to helping other people.
I think that's an important distinction, and it reminds me, I think it was the Wisdom Bank in Wales I heard you speak about once, which is just that, just going into the citizenry and saying, does anybody have a particular passion for or ability to, handle this particular issue. I do want to throw in a question we got here from Twitter. Is releasing data on data.gov routine now? Is that something that happens all the time?
So it's a great question. I should say I don't obviously serve in the federal government any longer, so I'm not there on a day-to-day basis, and I wouldn't say that it is. Let me say two things. One is data.gov is really just a pointer. It's not necessarily, quote, on data.gov. It is probably on the server of some ministry, and data.gov is essentially like the index. It points to the data where it goes up. It has definitely become more routine to make data available, and data that surely has been released to release more and more of that data. But I wouldn't say it's by any means the default yet. Again, because it is still not free and can be very costly to make data available. So I'll give you a quick example. It has been the law for many years on the books that the tax returns of nonprofits in the United States should be made available and open. But it's still the case that now if you want that data, you have to go to our, what we call the IRS, Internal Revenue, Inland Revenue for you, service to actually buy that data on a DVD. And now I think maybe they've taken the price tag off, but it's coming very soon, hopefully in the next few weeks, that you will actually be able to get that data online. But it's taken a long time to actually do that for a lot of cultural and technical and other reasons that we don't have time to go into. But even in a place where there was a legal mandate to open the data, it has taken years to actually make it truly accessible to people. To come back to the UK context, they are making a big push around open data, but controversies around patient consent have dramatically slowed down the ability. They've had a lot of questions about what can we put up online. Even on an anonymous basis, there's still a challenge about how data moves through the system and how it flows. And then you just have lots of systems which are super fragmented and complicated. I'm doing a lot of work right now looking at the criminal justice system in the United States, which is highly fragmented in terms of state, local, national, where different data is held and collected, how it flows, who has access to it, how it's used. And so forgetting about the anonymity issues for one moment, it's just really hard to even figure out where data goes in the system to know how to make it available. So yes, there are some areas in which it has now become routine. The data is put up online and published and more frequently published, but that's by no means the case. And even where a data set has been made available, the notion that we're actually updating that data is another challenge. So
yes,
better than it was, far from perfect. I wish I had a quantifiable number to give you, but we have a long way to go.
Well, and I can remember back in when I was a journalist walking into a prison system and seeing their office with just boxes and boxes of handwritten files on each of the individual prisoners. So you just can sort of start to picture the challenge there of getting the information flowing, digitized, available. I have asked this question of Joel. I'm going to ask it of our guest next week, Richard Sterling. I want to save enough time to ask this of you. What would an ideal day in the life of a data-driven participatory democracy look like for you?
What is a day in the? So I'll give you my favorite example. This is the ideal day I'm going to give you is already upon us. I'll give you the current, and then I'll give you a future state. And I say this, I never fail to mention this example, and apologies to those people who've heard me talk before. I will mention it again, because if there's nothing else that you take away, it is the idea that we should all go out and have the ability to save a life, which is something that we can do now in many communities thanks to open data. And I know, pals, that you know what I'm going to refer to, but which is not just in the U.S., thanks to a project called PulsePoint, but now in the U.K. with a project called, created by the London Air Ambulance called Good Sam. If you have CPR expertise, and we should all get trained or get refreshed on our certification, you can sign up to be able to become a citizen first responder. So what does that mean? It's driven in the end by open data. It's, we call it 911, the UK it's 999. The emergency number that you call when you're having a heart attack or have had an accident, that provides a piece of data which has now become that feed, that stream of data is being open in real time across thousands of communities. And with that, London Air Ambulance can create an app which allows the geolocation of the victim of the heart attack against a medically trained person, whether it's an amateur with CPR expertise or a doctor or a nurse or an off-duty ambulance driver, whatever it may be, and to get those people matched. Come back to our Tinder example. You're matching the supply of an expertise, namely CPR, with the demand for it, namely a victim having a heart attack, and you can bring those two people together. For every minute faster you get to that victim, you double the chances of saving their lives. That is a profound difference in the way that we do government, not relying only on a traditional first responder kind of ambulance, police, fire, etc., but the co-creation of government by bringing citizens into the picture. Now imagine that we do the same thing, but we think about it for people, family caregivers of people suffering from dementia, or small children, or people who are sick, or again have small children at home. The ability to geolocate and crowdsource and target, in other words, organize the ability of neighbors to help neighbors, so that we can address the challenges that we face, whether it's a heart attack or whether it's cooking a meal for somebody who needs it, or taking somebody else's kid to school, or frankly getting and sourcing the right help in the event of a disaster. That to me is the kind of thing that data makes available. It enables this kind of better coordination, better situational awareness about a crisis taking place, and at the same time data about the people who are involved, so that we can better coordinate and bring the right skills and know-how to the problem. So that I think is very exciting. So the future state, and I'll give you that's today, and then tomorrow is a lot more of that. And it's a lot more of that to allow us, again, to bring lots of expertise, especially. I'm particularly excited, as you know, about not just the data about the environment and the built landscape and the economy, but it's the data about us and what we know that is ultimately what's most important. Because when I have that data, when I know who the teachers are, when I know who the people are who've lived through an earthquake, when I know who has a degree in epidemiology, I can coordinate and source and bring that expertise together, create those teams that allow me to respond to challenges in new and better ways, hopefully faster, with more diverse and innovative thinking.
Well, I certainly hope that comes to pass, and I hate to cut you off because, again, we could go on for another hour, but now we do understand why you were named one of the Foreign Policy 100 by Foreign Policy, one of the 100 most creative people in business by Fast Company, and one of the top women in technology by Huffington Post. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. Again, Simone Novak joining us from New York and New York University, where she works and has been involved with open data and open government for quite a few years now. Thank you, Beth, and thank you all for joining us. We have one more in the series of 3 conversations about open data hosted by Land Information New Zealand, and we'll see you then.